There's a moment frozen in time, a moment where everything changes, where a young woman falls through the air, blonde hair streaming upward, arms reaching for a hero who's reaching back. But this isn't a story about how she died. This is a story about who she was before that fall, before the bridge, before the world knew her name as a tragedy. You think you know this story. You've seen the movies, read the comics, watched the animated series. But what if I told you that Gwen Stacy's real story isn't about her death at all? What if the true tragedy began the moment she smiled at a shy science student in a college hallway and decided he was worth knowing? What if her greatest power wasn't being Spider-Man's girlfriend, but being the one person who made Peter Parker believe he could have a normal life? Tonight, we're going back. Back before the Green Goblin, before the bridge, before the snap that echoed through 50 years of comic book history. We're going to uncover who Gwen Stacy really was. The brilliant mind behind the blonde hair. The daughter of a police captain who died in Spider-Man's arms. The woman who loved Peter Parker with everything she had, while hating the hero he secretly was. By the end of this story, you'll understand three things. First, why Gwen Stacy was never just a love interest, but the cornerstone of Peter Parker's entire world. Second, why her father's dying words to Spider-Man created an impossible burden that Peter carries to this day. And third, why one choice made on a bridge in 1973 didn't just kill a character. It killed the innocence of an entire generation of superhero storytelling. But here's what they don't tell you in the movies. Here's the secret that haunts every Spider-Man story ever written. On the night Gwen Stacy died, there was something she was about to tell Peter. Something that would have changed everything. Something Norman Osborn discovered first. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll finally learn what that secret was, and why it made her death even more devastating than you ever imagined. The story begins in 1965. But to understand why Gwen Stacy mattered, we need to understand the world she entered. It was the Silver Age of comics, a time when heroes always won, when good triumphed over evil. When the girl got saved, the hero got the kiss, and everyone lived to fight another day. Superman caught Lois Lane, Batman protected Robin, Captain America saved Bucky. The rules were simple. The heroes didn't lose the people they loved. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko had created something different with Spider-Man. A teenage hero who struggled with rent, who got bullied at school, who couldn't get a date because he was too nerdy. Peter Parker was revolutionary because he was real. But even Peter's problems were manageable. His girlfriend Betty Brant was sweet but simple. His crush Liz Allen was the popular girl who didn't understand him. His love life was typical teenage drama. Nothing that would break him, nothing that would change him forever. Marvel needed something more. Someone who could match Peter Parker's genius. Someone who could challenge him intellectually while supporting him emotionally. Someone who represented everything Peter wanted in a future. A normal life. A brilliant partner. A reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, being Peter Parker could be enough. Empire State University became the setting. The world of young adults trying to figure out who they were and who they wanted to become. Daily Bugle publisher J. Jonah Jameson was already painting Spider-Man as a menace. Oscorp Industries was already conducting experiments that would create monsters. Midtown Manhattan was already a battleground between heroes and villains. But inside the science building at ESU, in the chemistry labs and physics lectures, there was still a place where Peter Parker could just be a student, where he could dream of a life beyond the mask. This was the world before Gwen Stacy. A world where Spider-Man was still learning what it meant to be a hero. A world where Peter Parker still believed he could balance both sides of his life. A world that was about to be changed forever by a blonde girl with a brilliant mind and a police captain for a father. The character who would become the most important person in Peter Parker's life was about to make her first appearance. And though nobody knew it yet, especially not Peter, her arrival would start a countdown. A countdown to the most famous death in comic book history. A countdown to the moment that would define what it truly means to be Spider-Man. Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into the extraordinary world of spider lore, exploring hidden origins, untold tragedies, impossible choices, and the events that shape the destiny of our favorite heroes and villains. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the Spider-Verse. The Amazing Spider-Man issue 31, November 1965. Page 14, panel 3, that's where it happens. That's where Gwen Stacy walks into Peter Parker's life and changes absolutely everything. But she doesn't walk in like a typical comic book girl. She doesn't giggle or flutter her eyelashes or play damsel in distress. She walks into that Empire State University hallway with her head high, books clutched to her chest, blonde hair pulled back in a headband, and she looks at Peter Parker like he's just another face in the crowd. And for Peter, who's used to being invisible, who's used to being the nerdy kid nobody notices, that moment of being looked at and looked past simultaneously does something to him. It makes him want to be noticed, not as Spider-Man, as Peter Parker. Her name is Gwen Stacy, daughter of Captain George Stacy of the New York Police Department, raised in a middle-class home in Queens, not far from where Peter grew up in Forest Hills. But whereas Peter's world was defined by tragedy, by the loss of Uncle Ben, by the guilt that came with great power and great responsibility, Gwen's world was defined by structure, by a father who wore a badge and believed in justice, by a mother who passed away when Gwen was young, leaving her to be raised by a man who taught her that the world could be understood through facts, through evidence, through rational thinking. She was a science major, biochemistry with a focus on genetic research. In the comics, they show her giving a presentation on DNA sequencing that leaves the professor speechless. She wasn't just smart, she was brilliant, the kind of brilliant that intimidated other students, the kind of brilliant that made professors take notice, the kind of brilliant that Peter Parker recognized immediately because it matched his own. Their first real interaction is awkward. Peter's trying to talk to her between classes. He's stammering, dropping his books, making jokes that don't quite land. And Gwen just looks at him with these cool blue eyes and says something that cuts right through him. She says, "You're smarter than you pretend to be. Why do you hide it?" Nobody had ever asked Peter that before. Nobody had ever seen through the act. The bumbling nerd routine was protection. It kept people from asking too many questions. It kept them from wondering where he disappeared to, or why he always had bruises, or how he could afford those photographs he sold to the Daily Bugle. But Gwen saw through it in seconds, and that terrified Peter, because if she could see through one mask, maybe she could see through the other. But there was a complication. Actually, there were several complications. The first was named Mary Jane Watson, the girl next door who Aunt May kept trying to set Peter up with. The party girl with red hair and a smile that lit up rooms. MJ was everything Gwen wasn't. Spontaneous where Gwen was structured. Carefree where Gwen was serious. Fun where Gwen was focused. And Peter was caught between them, between the girl who made him laugh and the girl who made him think. The second complication was Harry Osborn, son of industrialist Norman Osborn, Peter's roommate and best friend at ESU. Harry was struggling with his father's expectations, struggling with his own insecurities, struggling with drugs, though that revelation would come later. And Harry had noticed Gwen too, had noticed the brilliant blonde in the science building who seemed untouchable, who seemed like she had everything figured out. So there's this dynamic forming. Peter Parker, torn between two women. Harry Osborn, wanting the one Peter's drawn to. Mary Jane Watson, playing it cool but clearly interested in Peter. And Gwen Stacy, in the middle of it all, seemingly unaware that she's become the center of everyone's attention, seemingly focused only on her studies, on her future, on building a life that makes sense, But that's the surface story. The story the comics show on the page. The real story is what's happening underneath. The real story is about a girl who lost her mother young and found stability in her father's unwavering sense of right and wrong. About a girl who threw herself into science because science had rules, equations that balanced, experiments that gave predictable results. A girl who was brilliant but lonely, who intimidated boys her age with her intelligence, who wanted connection but didn't know how to let people in past the walls she'd built. And then there's Peter. Peter who sees in Gwen everything he wishes he could be, stable, confident, certain about the future. Peter who's living a double life that's tearing him apart, who can't be in two places at once, who misses classes to fight the vulture, who cancels dates because the lizard is terrorizing the subway, who's constantly lying to everyone he cares about because the truth would put them in danger. But with Gwen, something shifts. When they start studying together, really spending time together, Peter realizes something. He realizes that around her, he wants to be Peter Parker, not Spider-Man. Just a college student with a brilliant girlfriend and a future that doesn't involve web-slinging and near-death experiences. Gwen makes him believe that maybe he can have both lives. Maybe he can be the hero and have the normal life. Maybe he doesn't have to sacrifice one for the other. Their relationship develops slowly. Study sessions in the library, coffee between classes, late-night conversations about science and philosophy and what they want out of life. Gwen opens up about losing her mother, about how it made her appreciate stability, about how she wants a future she can count on. And Peter, God help him, Peter promises her that future, promises her stability, promises her he'll always be there, all while knowing he's lying, all while knowing that Spider-Man could take him away at any moment. But the thing that really cements their relationship, the thing that makes Gwen choose Peter over everyone else is simple. Peter listens to her, not just to her words but to what she's not saying. He sees her loneliness. He sees her need for connection. He sees past the brilliant, confident exterior to the girl underneath who just wants someone to understand her. And because Peter knows what it's like to hide who you really are, he's the perfect person to see who Gwen really is. By issue 42, they're officially together. By issue 50, Gwen tells Peter she loves him. By issue 59, they're talking about getting married after graduation. Everything is perfect. Everything is exactly what Peter dreamed it could be. But there's someone else in this story. Someone who's been watching. Someone who sees how much Gwen means to Peter. Someone who knows things about Peter Parker that even Gwen doesn't know. Captain George Stacy, Gwen's father, police captain with 30 years on the force, expert on organized crime and now, increasingly, on the new phenomenon of costumed vigilantes. George Stacy has been studying Spider-Man, not to arrest him, to understand him. And the more he studies Spider-Man's movements, his patterns, his behavior, the more George Stacy sees something familiar. Something that reminds him of a young man he knows. A young man who's dating his daughter. George Stacy begins to suspect that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person. But instead of exposing him, George does something unexpected. He becomes Peter's advocate. He defends Spider-Man to his fellow officers. He argues that Spider-Man is a hero, not a menace. He becomes the father figure Peter lost when Uncle Ben died. And he does it all while knowing the terrible truth. While knowing that the boy dating his daughter is the same masked vigilante putting himself in danger every night. This is the foundation. Peter and Gwen, deeply in love. George Stacy, silently protecting Peter's secret while mentoring him from the shadows. Harry Osborn, struggling with his own demons while watching his best friend find happiness. Mary Jane Watson, pretending she doesn't care while secretly knowing more than she should. Everything is balanced on a knife's edge. Everything is perfect and fragile and about to shatter. Because in the shadows something is stirring. Norman Osborn, Harry's father, industrialist and secret Green Goblin, is beginning to remember things. Things about Spider-Man. Things about Peter Parker. memories that should have stayed buried, memories that will turn this love story into a tragedy. But for now, in these golden months between 1966 and 1969, Peter Parker is happy. Gwen Stacy is happy. They're planning a future together. They're talking about where they'll live after graduation, about the research they'll do together, about the life they'll build. Peter even begins to think that maybe, just maybe, he can tell Gwen the truth. Maybe she'll understand. Maybe she'll accept both sides of him. He has no idea that the decision to wait, to keep the secret just a little longer, will be the decision that destroys everything. He has no idea that the man who will take Gwen from him is already planning, already watching, already counting down the days until he strikes. The origin of Gwen Stacy is the origin of Peter Parker's greatest happiness. And like all great happiness in Spider-Man's life, it's just the calm before the storm, the light before the darkness, the dream before the nightmare begins. There's something almost cruel about the way happiness works in Peter Parker's life. Every moment of joy becomes a photograph he'll look at later, wondering if he could have held on tighter, protected it better, made it last just a little longer. The years between 1967 and 1970 were those photographs. Gwen studying in the library with afternoon light catching her hair. Gwen laughing at one of his terrible jokes. Gwen falling asleep on his shoulder during late-night study sessions. Peter didn't know he was living in borrowed time, but looking back, every moment carried the weight of something precious and temporary. Their relationship evolved in the way real relationships do, not through grand gestures but through accumulated moments of understanding. Gwen learned that Peter would disappear sometimes, that he'd show up late with flimsy excuses about freelance photography gigs or helping Aunt May. She learned to read his moods, to know when something was weighing on him that he couldn't talk about. And Peter, God help him, Peter learned to lie to the person he loved most. Every canceled date, every missed dinner, every time he had to choose between being with Gwen and being Spider-Man, he told himself it was to protect her. He told himself the lies were acts of love. George Stacy saw more than his daughter did. Much more. The police captain had been tracking Spider-Man's activities for months now, not to arrest him but to understand him. George had fought in World War II. He understood what it meant to sacrifice personal happiness for a greater good. And as he watched Peter Parker struggle to balance his relationship with Gwen against the increasingly frequent disappearances, George began to piece together what nobody else had figured out. The shy science student dating his daughter was the masked vigilante the Daily Bugle loved to vilify. But George Stacy did something remarkable. Instead of confronting Peter or exposing him, he became his silent guardian. When J. Jonah Jameson published another hit piece calling Spider-Man a menace, George would quietly defend the web-slinger at police headquarters. When officers suggested setting traps for Spider-Man, George would redirect their efforts toward actual criminals. He became the father figure Peter had lost when Uncle Ben died, offering advice and wisdom disguised as casual conversation. Peter never knew that his girlfriend's father was the only person in New York who truly understood the weight he carried. The relationship between Peter and Gwen deepened through shared experiences that had nothing to do with Spider-Man. They'd spend hours in the ESU science labs, working on research projects that excited both their brilliant minds. Gwen was specializing in genetic research, fascinated by the way DNA could be manipulated and altered. Peter, for obvious reasons he couldn't discuss, found her work both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes she'd describe an experiment involving genetic mutation in spiders or reptiles, and Peter would have to hide his reaction, knowing that he was living proof of what she was theorizing about. They talked about the future constantly. Gwen wanted to work for a research institute, maybe Oscorp or Stark Industries, somewhere she could make real contributions to genetic science. Peter talked about continuing his photography work, maybe becoming a science teacher. Neither mentioned the obvious truth that Peter's genius rivaled Gwen's own, that he could have any research position he wanted. Gwen attributed his modesty to his humble queen's upbringing. She didn't know that Peter couldn't commit to any future that required him to be reliable, present, and consistently available. Harry Osborn watched all of this with increasing bitterness. His best friend had found love and stability, while Harry spiraled deeper into addiction and depression. His relationship with his father Norman grew more toxic by the day, with the elder Osborn demanding perfection while providing nothing but criticism. Harry began using drugs to cope, started missing classes, withdrew from the friend group that had once sustained him. And through it all, he watched Peter and Gwen build something beautiful that seemed forever out of his reach. Mary Jane Watson handled Peter's relationship with Gwen differently. She kept her trademark smile, kept throwing parties, kept acting like she didn't care. But MJ had her own secret. She'd figured out Peter was Spider-Man months ago, had seen him crawling out of his bedroom window in costume one night when she was visiting Aunt May. Unlike George Stacy, MJ never told Peter she knew. She just watched, waiting for the inevitable moment when the double life would catch up with him, when it would hurt Gwen, when Peter would need someone who understood both sides of his life. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon in July 1970. Amazing Spider-Man issue 90, the day that would change everything. The day George Stacy died. Dr. Octopus had escaped from prison again, which was becoming almost routine by this point. Otto Octavius, brilliant scientist turned supervillain, rampaging through Manhattan with his mechanical arms. Spider-Man responded, as he always did, swinging between buildings to stop the threat. The fight was brutal and chaotic, taking them across rooftops and through construction sites. Civilians ran for cover as debris rained down from damaged buildings. George Stacy was off duty but nearby when the fight erupted. He saw people in danger and did what he'd done his entire career. He ran toward the danger instead of away from it. There was a child, maybe 6 years old, frozen with fear as a chimney collapsed above her. George didn't hesitate. He pushed the child to safety just as tons of brick and mortar came crashing down. Spider-Man saw it happen. Saw the police captain, the father of the woman he loved, crushed by falling debris from a fight Spider-Man had brought to this neighborhood. Peter pulled the rubble away with strength born of desperation, but he already knew. He already understood what he'd find underneath. George Stacy was dying. Blood spreading across his police uniform, bones broken beyond repair, breathing labored and wet. Peter knelt beside him, and this is where the cruelty of the moment becomes almost unbearable. Because George Stacy looked up at Spider-Man with clear eyes and said the words that would haunt Peter Parker for the rest of his life. "Be good to her, Peter, be good to my Gwen," 4 words that changed everything. Be good to her, Peter. Not Spider-Man, Peter. George Stacy had known all along, had protected Peter's secret while mentoring him, while welcoming him into his family, while trusting him with his daughter's heart. And now, with his last breath, George Stacy was asking Peter to do the one thing Peter's double life made impossible: to be good to Gwen, to be there for her, to be the stable, reliable presence she deserved. George Stacy died in Spider-Man's arms, 30 feet from where his daughter was shopping, completely unaware that her entire world was about to shatter. Peter attended the funeral as Peter Parker, not as Spider-Man. He stood beside Gwen as she wept, her body shaking with grief so profound it seemed impossible one person could contain it. She clutched Peter's hand so tightly it hurt, and Peter wanted to scream, wanted to tell her the truth, that her father had died during a Spider-Man fight, that Spider-Man had held him as he died, that her father's last words were about her, about protecting her, about a promise Peter didn't know if he could keep. But Peter said nothing. He held Gwen as she cried, and he lied through his silence. The grief transformed Gwen in ways that broke Peter's heart. The confident, brilliant woman he'd fallen in love with became fragile and uncertain. She'd lost her mother young, and now she'd lost her father too. Peter was all she had left. She clung to him with desperate intensity, terrified of losing another person she loved. She made Peter promise again and again that he wouldn't leave her, that he'd always be there, that she could count on him. And Peter promised, every single time, knowing he was lying, knowing that Spider-Man could take him away at any moment. But something else happened after George Stacy's death, something that created an impossible situation. Gwen began to hate Spider-Man. She blamed the masked vigilante for her father's death, for the fight that brought the chimney down, for being the reason her father ran toward danger instead of away from it. She'd lie in Peter's arms and talk about how much she despised Spider-Man, how he was a menace just like J. Jonah Jameson said, how the city would be better off without him. Peter would hold her and say nothing, dying inside, because Gwen loved Peter Parker with everything she had, and she hated Spider-Man with equal intensity. She loved and hated the same person, and she didn't even know it. The psychological torture of this situation cannot be overstated. Peter was grieving George Stacy too, grieving the mentor and father figure who had believed in him when nobody else did. George's last words haunted him. Be good to her. How could Peter be good to Gwen when every day he wore the mask she despised? How could he comfort her when he was the reason for her pain? How could he build a future with her when it was built on a foundation of lies? Their relationship intensified in the wake of tragedy, the way relationships sometimes do when people are desperate to hold onto something in the face of loss. They talked about marriage more seriously now, about finding an apartment together after graduation, about building a life that made sense, that was stable, that wouldn't fall apart the way everything else had. Gwen needed that stability more than she needed air, and Peter wanted to give it to her, wanted to be the man she needed, even though he knew he was living a lie. There were moments when Peter came close to telling her. Late nights when Gwen would fall asleep in his arms and Peter would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the confession in his mind. Gwen, I need to tell you something. I'm Spider-Man. I have been this whole time. Your father knew. He died knowing. He asked me to take care of you. But Peter could never find the words, could never figure out how to tell the woman who hated Spider-Man that she'd been in love with him all along. The secrecy created distance that Gwen couldn't understand. Peter would pull away sometimes, lost in guilt and grief and the impossible weight of George Stacy's dying wish. Gwen would interpret this as Peter having doubts about their relationship, about their future. She'd become clingy, desperate for reassurance, asking Peter over and over if he still loved her, if he was sure about them, if he was going to leave her like everyone else had left her. And Peter would reassure her, would promise his love was real, all while knowing that the biggest part of his life was something he could never share with her. The mask had become more than just a secret identity. It had become a wall between them, invisible but absolutely impassable. Harry Osborn's descent continued during this period, his drug use escalating, his relationship with his father deteriorating. Norman Osborn grew more erratic and unpredictable, his behavior suggesting that something was wrong beneath the surface. But Peter was too consumed with his own grief and guilt to notice the warning signs. He didn't see that Norman was starting to remember things. Things about the Green Goblin, things about Spider-Man, things about Peter Parker. Mary Jane stayed close during this period, offering support to both Peter and Gwen but maintaining her emotional distance. She understood what Gwen didn't, that Peter was carrying weight that would eventually crush him. MJ waited, knowing that eventually the truth would come out, and when it did, Gwen would need a friend who understood, and Peter would need someone who had always known both sides of him. The months after George Stacy's death were a study in delayed tragedy. Peter and Gwen grew closer while the foundation of their relationship cracked beneath them. Gwen made plans for a future that would never happen. Peter made promises he couldn't keep. And somewhere in the background, Norman Osborn's memories returned, piece by piece, until he remembered everything. Until he remembered that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Until he started planning his revenge. George Stacy's death was the wound that never healed. It was the moment when Peter's two lives became incompatible in a way they'd never been before. It was the crack in the dam that would eventually destroy everything. But Peter couldn't see it yet. He was too busy trying to be good to Gwen, trying to honor a dead man's wish, trying to build a life on a foundation of lies that was already crumbling beneath his feet. The transformation was complete. Gwen had gone from confident and independent to emotionally fragile and dependent on Peter. Peter had gone from hopeful about balancing his two lives to drowning in guilt and secrets. Their relationship had gone from healthy and mutual to built on grief, lies, and desperate promises neither could keep. Everything had changed. Everything had become darker, heavier, more fragile. And Norman Osborn, wearing his son's face in public while the Green Goblin lurked beneath the surface, watched it all. Watched Peter Parker with the girlfriend he adored. Watched the young couple planning their future. Watched and planned and waited for the perfect moment to take everything away. To prove to Spider-Man that heroes don't get happy endings. That loving someone when you wear a mask is the cruelest thing you can do to them. The stage was set. The players were in position. All that remained was for the Green Goblin to make his move, to target the one person whose loss would break Spider-Man completely, to kill Gwen Stacy and prove that being Peter Parker and being Spider-Man were incompatible. That Peter would have to choose, and that choosing would destroy him either way. Amnesia is a convenient tool in comic books. It allows characters to forget their secret identities, to reset relationships, to pretend terrible things never happened. Norman Osborn had been suffering from selective amnesia for months after his last battle with Spider-Man, an encounter that had ended with Norman impaled on his own goblin glider. The amnesia had been a gift, really. It meant Norman Osborn, the respected industrialist, didn't remember being the Green Goblin, didn't remember his crimes, didn't remember discovering that Peter Parker and Spider-Man were the same person. But amnesia in the Marvel Universe is never permanent, especially not when the psychosis runs as deep as Norman's did. The Green Goblin wasn't just a costume Norman wore. It was a separate personality, a manifestation of his madness, a dark alter ego that wanted control. And slowly, inevitably, it was coming back. The first signs appeared in small ways. Norman would have flashes of memory, brief moments where he'd see Peter Parker and feel rage he couldn't explain. He'd find himself drawn to his private lab at Oscorp, the one where he'd created the formula that turned him into the Goblin. He'd wake from nightmares of gliders and pumpkin bombs, and a laughing green face that looked like his own reflection in a broken mirror. Harry noticed his father's deteriorating mental state, but misinterpreted it as stress from running Oscorp. Harry's own addiction had progressed to the point where he could barely function, and he projected his own demons onto his father. He didn't see that Norman was fighting a war inside his own mind, a war the Green Goblin was slowly winning. By late 1972, Norman's memories had mostly returned. He remembered everything. He remembered being the Green Goblin. He remembered fighting Spider-Man. He remembered unmasking him. He remembered that Peter Parker, his son's best friend, the boy dating that pretty blonde girl, was the wall crawler who had defeated him and caused his amnesia in the first place. But Norman was intelligent enough to hide his knowledge. He continued playing the role of concerned father and respected businessman, while the Goblin personality whispered in his ear, planning revenge. And the Goblin understood something that made him infinitely more dangerous than other Spider-Man villains. The Goblin understood that you don't defeat Spider-Man by attacking him directly. You defeat Spider-Man by destroying Peter Parker. Other villains went after Spider-Man with brute force. Dr. Octopus with his mechanical arms, the Rhino with his strength, the Vulture with his wings. They fought the hero and inevitably lost. But the Green Goblin was smarter than that. The Green Goblin understood that Spider-Man's greatest weakness wasn't physical. It was emotional. It was the people Peter Parker loved. Gwen Stacy became visible in Norman's planning not as a person but as a weapon. She was the girlfriend, the woman Peter Parker wanted to marry, The one thing that gave Peter hope for a normal future. Take her away, and you take away Peter's reason for trying to balance his two lives. Take her away, and you prove that being Spider-Man means sacrificing everything that makes Peter Parker human. Norman began his campaign with remarkable patience. He didn't attack immediately. Instead, he inserted himself into Peter and Gwen's lives through social connections. Oscorp had business dealings with Empire State University. Norman attended fundraisers where Gwen was present. He made sure to be charming, to be the concerned father figure, to build trust. Gwen saw him only as Harry's troubled father, a man trying to help his son through addiction. She had no idea she was talking to a predator. Peter's spider sense, that unconscious warning system that alerted him to danger, would trigger randomly around this time. He'd be having coffee with Gwen and suddenly feel the familiar tingle at the base of his skull. He'd look around, see nothing threatening, and dismiss it. He'd be at Harry's apartment and feel danger approaching, only to see Norman Osborn walk through the door with groceries for his son. The warnings were constant, and Peter couldn't understand them. His spider sense didn't distinguish between Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin. It just knew there was a threat nearby. The psychological warfare began subtly. Norman would mention things in casual conversation that only the Green Goblin should know. He'd reference fights with Spider-Man in ways that seemed innocent but made Peter's blood run cold. He'd ask Peter about his photography work, specifically about his Spider-Man photos, in ways that felt loaded with meaning. He was letting Peter know, without directly stating it, that he remembered everything. That he knew Peter's secret, that he was choosing the time and place for his revenge. Peter couldn't tell anyone, couldn't warn Gwen that Norman Osborn was dangerous without explaining why he knew that, couldn't tell Harry that his father was the Green Goblin without proof and without destroying what was left of their friendship. Couldn't even tell Aunt May, who would worry herself into a heart attack. Peter was trapped, knowing danger was coming but unable to stop it, unable even to explain it. The isolation was crushing. Peter would lie awake at night next to Gwen, listening to her breathe, knowing she was in danger but unable to protect her without revealing why she was a target. He considered breaking up with her, pushing her away for her own safety, but he knew Gwen wouldn't understand. After losing her mother and father, losing Peter would destroy her. The cure would be as bad as the disease. Norman's planning went beyond simple stalking. He studied Gwen's routines, learned her class schedule, knew which coffee shop she frequented, which library she studied at, which route she took home. He compiled information the way a serial killer compiles information about his victim. Because that's what this was: premeditated murder. The Green Goblin wanted Gwen dead, and Norman Osborn's intelligence combined with the Goblin's madness made him patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. Harry's apartment became a nightmare space for Peter. He'd visit his best friend trying to help Harry through his addiction, and Norman would be there, smiling, offering coffee, making small talk, and underneath every word was the unspoken threat. I know who you are, I know who matters to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming. Gwen noticed Peter's increasing paranoia but attributed it to stress. She thought he was worried about his aunt, or about money, or about graduation. She tried to comfort him, tell him everything would be okay, that they'd face whatever came together. And Peter would hold her and think about how those were the exact wrong words, how they wouldn't face this together, how when Norman finally struck, Gwen wouldn't even understand why she was dying. The terrible irony was that Gwen liked Norman Osborn. She thought he was a kind man struggling to connect with his troubled son. She'd have conversations with him at social events, talking about science and research, not knowing she was discussing genetics with a man whose genetic experiment had turned him into a monster. She saw him as a potential mentor, someone who could help her get a position at Oscorp after graduation. She was planning a future that included the man who was planning her death. Mary Jane saw more than Gwen did. MJ had always been perceptive, and she noticed Norman's interest in Gwen. The way his eyes would follow her at parties. The way he'd engineer conversations to learn more about her relationship with Peter. MJ tried to warn Peter once, suggested that something about Norman Osborn felt wrong. But Peter couldn't explain why MJ's instincts were correct without revealing too much, so he dismissed her concerns. Another failure. Another person trying to help who Peter pushed away to protect his secret. The months between late 1972 and early 1973 were suffocating. Peter watched Norman Osborn circle closer to Gwen like a shark circling prey. His spider sense became almost useless because it was constantly triggering. Danger, 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 all the time, everywhere, until Peter learned to ignore it, which was exactly what the Green Goblin wanted. Norman's psychological state deteriorated as the Goblin personality took more control. There were moments when Norman would seem confused, would look at Peter with genuine affection, would talk about Peter being like a second son to him. And then the mask would slip, and Peter would see the Goblin looking out through Norman's eyes, and the smile would turn predatory. Norman was fighting and losing a war against his own madness, and everyone around him was collateral damage waiting to happen. Harry's condition worsened throughout this period, his addiction spiraling out of control. Peter was torn between helping his best friend and protecting his girlfriend, unable to do either effectively because both problems traced back to Norman Osborn. Harry needed his father to get help. Gwen needed Peter to explain why she should stay away from Norman, and Peter couldn't help either of them without revealing secrets that would destroy everything. Gwen made plans during this time, beautiful, innocent plans for a future that would never happen. She talked about their wedding, about where they'd live, about the research position she'd apply for at Oscorp. She even mentioned that Norman had suggested he could help her get an interview, that he thought highly of her. Peter listened to her talk about accepting help from the man who wanted to kill her, and he couldn't say anything, couldn't warn her, could only smile and nod and die inside. There were moments when Peter considered going to the police, turning himself in as Spider-Man if it meant protecting Gwen. But he knew it wouldn't work. Norman would just attack anyway, and Peter would be powerless to stop him from behind bars. The Goblin wanted Peter free, wanted him to feel helpless, wanted him to understand that all his power meant nothing when someone he loved was the target. The trap was set with exquisite cruelty. Norman knew Peter couldn't quit being Spider-Man. Knew Peter's sense of responsibility would force him to keep putting on the mask, keep fighting crime, keep being a hero. So Norman just had to wait for a moment when Peter was distracted by some other threat, when his attention was divided, when he couldn't be everywhere at once. That's when the Goblin would strike. Gwen mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge once in passing, said it was her favorite landmark in New York. She loved the view, loved the architecture, loved walking across it on clear days when you could see the whole city spread out below. She said it made her feel hopeful about the future, seeing all of New York laid out like a promise of everything yet to come. Peter filed that information away without understanding why it made him feel cold. Norman Osborn heard her say it too, heard her talk about loving the bridge, and the Green Goblin smiled because he'd just found the perfect place, the perfect stage for the final act, the place where Gwen Stacy would die and Peter Parker would learn the true cost of being Spider-Man. By March 1973, everything was in position. Norman's memories were fully restored. His Green Goblin equipment was ready. His plan was perfected. He knew Gwen's schedule, knew Peter's patterns, knew exactly how to separate them long enough to make his move. All that remained was choosing the moment. Peter felt it coming. That's the worst part. He knew something terrible was about to happen. His spider sense was screaming at him constantly now, and his dreams were filled with images of falling, of webs snapping, of reaching for something just beyond his grasp. He held Gwen tighter during this period, told her he loved her more frequently, made promises about their future with desperate intensity. Like he was trying to pack a lifetime of love into whatever time they had left. Gwen noticed but misunderstood. She thought Peter was finally ready to commit fully, to propose, to start their real life together. She bought a dress she thought she might wear to their wedding. She looked at apartments they might rent after graduation. She made plans for a future that was already being erased, written over by a madman's revenge plot. The Green Goblin waited, patient, prepared, hungry for the moment when he would prove that Spider-Man couldn't save everyone. That Peter Parker's greatest power, his love for others, was actually his greatest weakness. That responsibility meant sacrifice, and some sacrifices were too terrible to bear. And when the moment came, when Norman Osborn finally became the Green Goblin again and went hunting for Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker was exactly where Norman knew he'd be, somewhere else, fighting some other threat, being the hero, while the woman he loved was alone, unprotected, unaware that she had minutes left to live. Every person in Gwen Stacy's orbit knew something she didn't. Every relationship in her life was built on secrets, half-truths, and information deliberately withheld for her protection. She moved through a world where everyone else could see the walls, closing in while she remained blind to the danger. Understanding who Gwen was means understanding these relationships, the people who shaped her life, and the ways they failed to save her when it mattered most. Peter Parker was the sun around which Gwen's world orbited after her father died. She loved him with the kind of intensity that comes from loss, the desperate love of someone who has already buried too many people and can't bear the thought of losing one more. To Gwen, Peter represented stability in a world that had proven itself catastrophically unstable. He was brilliant but humble, kind but strong, present but mysterious in ways she found intriguing rather than threatening. She built her entire future around him, made every plan with him as the foundation, needed him the way you need oxygen. But Gwen's Peter and the real Peter were different people. She loved a version of him that was incomplete, that was missing the most important part. She loved Peter Parker, the science student, the freelance photographer, the sweet boyfriend who held her when she cried and made her feel safe. She had no idea that the person holding her had blood on his hands from fighting criminals the night before, that the reason he was sometimes distant or distracted was because he was calculating how to stop some new threat to the city, that the man she wanted to marry was the masked vigilante she blamed for her father's death. Peter's love for Gwen was equally intense but poisoned by guilt. He loved her genuinely, wanted the life she imagined for them, dreamed of marrying her and building something normal and stable. But every moment with her was torture because he knew he was lying. Every kiss carried the weight of secrets. Every promise about the future was built on a foundation of deception. Peter loved Gwen enough to want to be just Peter Parker for her, but he couldn't stop being Spider-Man. And those two truths were incompatible. The relationship was doomed from the beginning, though neither of them knew it. Gwen needed total honesty and Peter couldn't give it. Gwen needed someone who would always be there, and Peter had a city that needed saving. Gwen needed to trust completely, and Peter's entire life was a lie. They loved each other genuinely, but they were loving different versions of reality. Gwen was in love with a man who didn't exist. Peter was in love with a woman he couldn't protect. George Stacy haunted the relationship even after his death. In life, he had been the bridge between Peter's two worlds, the only person besides Peter himself who understood both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. George had given his blessing to the relationship while knowing its fundamental impossibility. His dying words, "Be good to her," became the chain Peter dragged through every day, the impossible command that demanded Peter be present for Gwen while his responsibilities as Spider-Man constantly pulled him away. Gwen idolized her father's memory. George became a saint in her mind after his death, the perfect father who had protected her, guided her, believed in her. She talked about him constantly, about his values and his wisdom and his faith in doing the right thing. And every conversation about George was another knife in Peter's chest, because Gwen's perfect father had died during a Spider-Man fight, had died asking Spider-Man to protect his daughter, had died knowing Peter was living a lie. George's relationship with Gwen had been genuinely close. He'd raised her alone after her mother died, had been both father and mother, had encouraged her scientific interests, had taught her to be independent and strong, but he'd also left her unprepared for his death, had never told her that loving someone meant accepting the possibility of losing them, had never explained that sometimes the good guys die too. So when George was killed, Gwen's entire worldview shattered. The universe wasn't fair or just or logical. It was random and cruel, and it took good people for no reason. Mary Jane Watson was Gwen's best friend and worst enemy, though Gwen only understood half of that equation. On the surface, MJ was the fun-loving party girl who provided contrast to Gwen's seriousness. They'd go shopping together, study together, talk about boys and classes and futures. MJ was there when Gwen cried about her father, offered a shoulder and support and friendship that seemed genuine and uncomplicated. But MJ knew Peter's secret, had known for months, had seen him in costume, had put the pieces together, and had chosen to say nothing. So every conversation with Gwen was a performance. Every time Gwen complained about Spiderman, blamed him for her father's death, talked about how much she hated the masked vigilante, MJ had to smile and nod and pretend she didn't know that Gwen was actually talking about Peter, that the man Gwen loved and the hero she hated were the same person. MJ's feelings for Peter complicated everything further. She'd been interested in him first, back before he noticed Gwen. But Peter had chosen Gwen, had fallen for the brilliant blonde instead of the fun redhead. MJ pretended it didn't hurt, kept up her carefree facade, but underneath she was waiting for the moment when Peter's double life destroyed his relationship with Gwen, waiting for the moment when Peter would need someone who understood both sides of him, waiting for her chance. The friendship between MJ and Gwen was genuine despite the lies. They really did care about each other, really did support each other through heartbreak and stress and uncertainty. But the foundation was rotten because MJ knew something that would destroy Gwen if she learned it. MJ was protecting Peter's secret, but in doing so, she was participating in the lie that defined Gwen's entire relationship. She was choosing Peter's needs over Gwen's right to know the truth. Harry Osborn was the tragic third wheel in this dynamic. He loved Gwen too, in his way, though he'd never admit it outright. She represented everything he wanted and couldn't have: stability, confidence, a future that made sense. Harry was spiraling into addiction and depression while watching his best friend build a life with the woman Harry wished he was strong enough to pursue. The resentment festered even as Harry tried to be supportive, tried to be happy for Peter and Gwen, tried to be the good friend he knew he should be. Gwen viewed Harry with sympathy and concern. She saw his struggles, his addiction, his toxic relationship with his father. She tried to help, offered support and encouragement, but she couldn't fix what was broken in Harry. Nobody could. And Harry knew that Gwen's concern was rooted in friendship, not attraction. She cared about him the way you care about someone who's hurting, not the way she cared about Peter. The distinction tortured him. Harry's relationship with Peter was equally complicated. They were genuinely best friends, had been roommates, had supported each other through crises. But Harry was also drowning, and Peter was too distracted by his own problems to throw him a lifeline. Peter knew Harry was using drugs, knew his friend was in trouble, but Spider-Man's responsibilities kept pulling him away from Harry's needs. Another failure. Another person Peter couldn't save because he was busy being a hero. Norman Osborn was the monster in the closet that Gwen never saw. To her, he was Harry's troubled father, a successful businessman struggling to connect with his addicted son. She felt sorry for Norman, thought he was trying his best in a difficult situation. She'd have polite conversations with him at social gatherings, would talk about her research interests, would accept his offers to help her get interviews at Oscorp. She trusted him because he was Harry's father and Harry was Peter's best friend. The connections all seemed safe and reasonable. But Norman was the Green Goblin, and the Green Goblin saw Gwen as a tool for hurting Spider-Man. Every kind word Norman spoke to her was calculated. Every offer of help was part of a larger plan. Every smile hid teeth. He was studying her, learning her routines and patterns, identifying her as the perfect target. And Gwen had no idea because nobody had told her that Norman Osborn was dangerous. Nobody could tell her without revealing secrets that would unravel everything. The relationship between Norman and Peter was pure psychological warfare. Norman knew Peter was Spider-Man. Peter knew Norman knew. They'd have conversations loaded with double meanings, verbal chess matches where every word carried multiple interpretations. Norman would mention things only the Green Goblin should know, would hint at future plans, would make veiled threats about people Peter cared about. And Peter couldn't respond directly, couldn't confront him, because Norman had plausible deniability. He was just being friendly, just being a concerned father figure, just making conversation. Norman's relationship with his own son was toxic and codependent. He enabled Harry's addiction while simultaneously criticizing him for weakness. He wanted Harry to be strong like him, but also wanted Harry to fail so Norman could feel superior. The Green Goblin personality made everything worse, introducing additional instability and cruelty. Harry was caught between loving his father and recognizing that his father was destroying him. And when Harry eventually learned that his father was the Green Goblin, that knowledge would break whatever fragile pieces of him remained intact. Aunt May represented normalcy for both Peter and Gwen. She was Peter's family, the woman who raised him after his parents died, who provided unconditional love even when she didn't understand him. Gwen adored Aunt May, saw her as the mother-in-law she hoped to have someday. They'd have tea together, talk about Peter, share stories. Aunt May approved of Gwen completely, saw her as the stable influence Peter needed, the future daughter-in-law who would give her grandchildren. But Aunt May was also another person Peter had to lie to, another person who couldn't know about Spider-Man. And Gwen's relationship with Aunt May was based on a fantasy future that would never happen. Every conversation about wedding plans or grandchildren was a ghost of a life that was already being erased. Aunt May would lose Gwen without ever understanding why, would watch Peter's relationship end in tragedy and never know that it was Spider-Man's fault. The web of relationships around Gwen was intricate and poisoned by secrets. Everyone knew something. Nobody knew everything. Peter knew he was Spider-Man. MJ knew Peter was Spider-Man. George had known Peter was Spider-Man. Norman knew Peter was Spider-Man. And Gwen, the person whose life depended on understanding the danger she was in, knew nothing. She moved through her world blind, trusting people who were lying to her, loving someone who couldn't be honest with her, planning a future that was already forfeit. The tragedy of Gwen Stacy isn't just that she died. It's that she died without ever understanding why. Died without knowing that everyone around her had been keeping secrets. Died believing she was loved by Peter Parker, never knowing she was killed because of Spider-Man. Died thinking her father had been a random casualty, never knowing he died protecting Spider-Man's identity. Died making plans for a wedding that would never happen, a research career that would never start, children she'd never have, a life she'd never live. Every relationship in her life was a lie of omission. Everyone who loved her failed to tell her the truth that might have saved her. And the worst part is that they all had good reasons. Peter couldn't tell her he was Spider-Man because it would put her in danger. MJ couldn't tell her she knew because it was Peter's secret to share. George couldn't tell her before he died because revealing Spider-Man's identity, even to his daughter, violated the trust between them. Norman couldn't tell her because he was planning to kill her anyway. Gwen Stacy died surrounded by people who loved her, protected by people who failed to save her, betrayed by the very secrets that were supposed to keep her safe. And when she fell from that bridge, every one of these relationships fell with her. Peter lost his innocence. MJ lost her friend. Harry lost his anchor. Norman lost his last connection to humanity. Aunt May lost the daughter-in-law she'd hoped for. And Gwen lost everything, falling through the air toward death, never understanding why. The date was June 1973. The Amazing Spider-Man issue 121, a comic book that would change the industry forever, though nobody knew it yet. The cover showed Spider-Man reaching desperately toward a falling figure, with text that read, "The night Gwen Stacy died." But even that warning couldn't prepare readers for what was inside, couldn't prepare them for the moment that would haunt Spider-Man for the next 50 years. Peter had been fighting crime in Lower Manhattan when his spider sense exploded with an intensity he'd never felt before. Not a tingle, not a warning, a scream. Every nerve in his body telling him something was catastrophically wrong. He swung through the city in a panic, following an instinct he couldn't name, knowing only that someone he loved was in terrible danger. He tried calling Gwen's apartment. No answer. He tried Aunt May. She hadn't heard from Gwen. He felt the world narrowing to a single point of terror. Then he found the note. Left at his apartment, written in handwriting he recognized immediately. Norman Osborn's handwriting, but the message was pure Green Goblin. It gave an address, a location, and it promised that if Peter wanted to see Gwen alive again, he'd come alone. No police, no other heroes, just Spider-Man and the Goblin settling their score once and for all. Peter knew it was a trap, knew that going meant playing exactly into Norman's hands. But what choice did he have? This was Gwen, the woman he loved, the woman he'd promised to protect, the woman whose father had died asking Peter to take care of her. He couldn't not go, couldn't prioritize strategy over her life. So he went, swinging through the night toward the address Norman had provided, toward whatever nightmare the Green Goblin had prepared. The location was an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Peter arrived to find it empty except for signs of struggle. Gwen's purse on the floor, her scarf torn and discarded, evidence that she'd been there, that she'd been taken somewhere else. Another note, this one directing him to the real location, the George Washington Bridge, of course. The place Gwen had said was her favorite spot in New York. Norman had been listening, had remembered, had chosen the location specifically to maximize the cruelty. Peter swung toward the bridge with his heart in his throat, every second feeling like an eternity. The night was clear and cold, the kind of night where you could see your breath, where the city lights reflected off the water below. Beautiful, if you could ignore the horror unfolding above it. Peter could see the bridge's towers rising into the darkness, and perched at the top of one of them, silhouetted against the night sky, was the Green Goblin, standing on his glider holding something in his arms. Someone in his arms. Gwen. Peter could see her even from a distance, blonde hair whipping in the wind, body limp like she was unconscious or drugged. The Green Goblin was holding her casually, almost carelessly, like she was a prop in a play rather than a human being. Peter landed on the bridge tower's crossbeam, 20 feet from where Norman hovered on his glider, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Hero and villain, Peter Parker and Norman Osborn, Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, all of it true simultaneously. Norman spoke first. His voice was wrong, distorted by the goblin mask but also by madness. He talked about how long he'd waited for this moment, how perfect it was, how Spider-Man had taken everything from him, his memories, his dignity, his power, and now the Goblin would return the favor, would take the one thing that mattered to Peter Parker, would prove that being a hero meant losing everyone you loved. Peter tried to reason with him, tried to reach whatever remained of Norman Osborn underneath the Goblin persona, reminded him that they'd been friends once, that Peter had looked up to him, that Harry needed his father. But the words bounced off the madness like rain off glass. Norman wasn't interested in reason. He was interested in revenge, in proving a point, in making Spider-Man understand that power meant nothing if you couldn't protect the people who mattered. Gwen stirred in Norman's arms, started to wake up. Peter could see her confusion, could see her trying to understand where she was and what was happening. She looked up at the Green Goblin holding her and screamed. Looked over at Spider-Man standing on the tower and screamed again, because to Gwen, these were both monsters. The villain who'd killed her father and the hero she blamed for not stopping him. She didn't know that one of them was Peter, didn't know that the man she loved was desperately trying to figure out how to save her. Norman laughed at her terror, laughed at Peter's obvious anguish. And then, with casual cruelty that still seems impossible to believe, he simply let go, dropped Gwen Stacy off the George Washington Bridge like she was garbage he was discarding, just opened his arms and let her fall. The world went silent. That's what Peter would remember later. The moment Gwen started falling, every sound disappeared. No traffic from below, no wind, no city noise. Just the image of Gwen tumbling through the air, arms reaching upward, body twisting, falling toward the water 200 feet below. Peter didn't think, couldn't think. He just dove after her, shooting a web line as he fell, aiming for her leg, for her body, for anything he could catch. The web connected, wrapped around her leg just feet from the water. The line went taut. Peter braced himself against the bridge support, holding the web with everything he had. He'd caught her. Thank God he'd caught her. He started pulling her up, hand over hand, relief flooding through him. She was safe. He'd saved her. Everything would be okay. But as he pulled her body up to the bridge, as he gathered her in his arms and laid her gently on the concrete, Peter realized something was wrong. Gwen wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at nothing. Her neck was bent at an angle that necks shouldn't bend. And in the terrible silence that followed, Peter understood what had happened. The fall hadn't killed her. The water hadn't killed her. The web had killed her. When it caught her leg and stopped her descent, the sudden deceleration had snapped her neck. Whiplash. Basic physics. The same principle that makes car crashes deadly even when the car doesn't hit anything directly. Peter had stopped her fall, but the stopping itself had been lethal. His web, his power, his attempt to save her had killed the woman he loved. Peter knelt there holding Gwen's body, and something inside him broke. He pulled her close, cradled her head, whispered her name over and over like saying it enough times would bring her back. But she was gone. Eyes open and empty, skin already cooling. The future they'd planned together erased in a single moment. The wedding they'd talked about would never happen. The children she'd wanted would never be born. The research she dreamed of doing would remain undone. Everything she was and everything she could have been ended. The Green Goblin's laughter cut through Peter's grief. Norman was circling overhead on his glider, cackling with victory. He'd won. He'd proven his point. Spiderman couldn't save everyone. Peter Parker's love had gotten Gwen killed. With great power came great responsibility, and Peter had failed that responsibility in the worst possible way. The person he was trying hardest to protect was the one he'd killed. Something shifted in Peter in that moment. The grief transformed into rage so pure and absolute it felt like a physical thing. He laid Gwen's body gently on the bridge, closed her eyes with shaking fingers, and then he went after Norman with an intensity that terrified even himself. No quips, no jokes, no pulling punches. Peter wanted to kill him, needed to kill him, would have killed him if given the chance. The fight that followed was brutal. Peter caught up to the Green Goblin and dragged him off his glider, and they fell together onto the bridge deck. Peter beat Norman with his fists, each punch carrying all the grief and rage and guilt he couldn't express any other way. Norman's mask cracked, his costume tore, blood appeared on his face. And still Peter kept hitting him, kept punishing him, kept trying to make him pay for what he'd taken. Norman was laughing even as Peter beat him, laughing because he'd won, because even if Spider-Man killed him, it wouldn't bring Gwen back, because Peter Parker would have to live with what happened for the rest of his life, would have to live with the knowledge that his web had snapped her neck, that his power had killed her, that being Spider-Man made it impossible to keep anyone safe. Peter didn't stop until he heard a sound that cut through his rage. The whine of the goblin's glider, rising behind him, its blade spinning. Norman had triggered it remotely, sent it flying toward Peter at killing speed. Peter's spider sense screamed and he dove aside at the last second. The glider, unable to stop or correct course, impaled Norman Osborn through the chest, just as it had done in their previous battle, just as it would do in future battles. The glider was both Norman's weapon and his executioner, the tool he used to kill that inevitably killed him instead. Norman fell, blood spreading across his green costume, the goblin persona fading as death approached. For a moment, Norman looked at Peter with clear eyes, seemed to recognize him as Peter Parker rather than Spider-Man, seemed to realize what he'd done and what it had cost. But then the light went out and Norman Osborn died, impaled on his own weapon, killed by his own madness. Peter should have felt something, victory or relief or closure, but he felt nothing. Norman's death didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the body lying on the bridge behind him. Peter walked back to where Gwen lay, knelt beside her again and picked her up, held her the way a groom carries a bride across a threshold, except there would be no threshold, no wedding, no future. Just this moment, just this unbearable present. He considered taking her to a hospital but knew it was pointless. She was gone, had been gone from the moment the web caught her, had died instantly, the medical examiner would later confirm. Cervical fracture, instantaneous death. She hadn't suffered, which was a small mercy, but she also hadn't known that Spider-Man was Peter. Hadn't understood that the person trying to save her was the person who loved her most. Had died thinking she was being fought over by two people she hated, never knowing that one of them was the man she'd planned to marry. Peter couldn't bring himself to leave her. Couldn't accept that this was real, that she was really dead, that the laughter and intelligence and love that had been Gwen Stacy was just gone. He held her body and he cried, the mask hiding his tears but unable to hide the way his body shook with grief. This was the cost. This was what responsibility meant. This was the price of being Spider-Man. The police arrived eventually, called by witnesses who'd seen the fight on the bridge. Peter had to let them take Gwen's body, had to watch strangers load her onto a stretcher and cover her with a sheet, had to swing away without being able to explain, without being able to stay with her, without being able to say goodbye properly. Because Spider-Man didn't get to grieve publicly. Spider-Man didn't get to attend funerals or explain what happened or find comfort in other people's sympathy. Spider-Man was a mask, and behind the mask, Peter Parker died with Gwen Stacy on that bridge. The comic ended with a single panel, Spider-Man swinging away from the bridge, leaving behind the woman he loved and the man who'd killed her. The caption read simply, "Spider-Man no more." But that question had already been answered. Peter would keep being Spider-Man. Not because he wanted to. Not because it brought him joy or satisfaction or made him feel powerful. But because George Stacy had asked him to be good to Gwen, and the only way Peter could honor that request now was to make sure nobody else died the way she had. To make sure her death meant something. To carry the weight of her loss and keep being a hero despite it. The night Gwen Stacy died, something fundamental changed in comic books. Heroes had lost before. Heroes had faced tragedy and hardship and temporary setbacks. But heroes didn't fail to save their loved ones. Heroes didn't accidentally kill the people they were trying to protect. Heroes didn't kneel on bridges holding dead girlfriends and contemplating whether being a hero was worth the cost. Until they did. Until Spider-Man did. Until Peter Parker learned that with great power comes great responsibility, and sometimes that responsibility is too heavy to carry. Sometimes you do everything right and people still die. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes being a hero means losing everything that makes you human. Gwen Stacy died on a bridge in 1973, and Peter Parker's innocence died with her. The funeral happened on a gray afternoon that felt appropriate for burying dreams. Peter Parker stood in the back of the crowd at the cemetery, wearing his only suit, the one he'd bought thinking he might wear it to his wedding someday. The irony wasn't lost on him. Around him gathered everyone who had loved Gwen Stacy, friends from Empire State University, professors who had recognized her brilliance, distant relatives who hadn't seen her since childhood, all of them crying, all of them grieving, none of them understanding the full truth of how she died. Peter couldn't get close to the casket, couldn't stand with the family, couldn't be in the front row where boyfriends were supposed to be, because Spider-Man had been there when Gwen died and questions were being asked. The police wanted to know what happened on that bridge, why Gwen Stacy had been taken there, what Spider-Man's involvement had been. Peter's alibi was non-existent because Peter Parker hadn't been anywhere that night. He'd been wearing a mask, and now he had to pretend he knew nothing while the woman he loved was lowered into the ground. Mary Jane found him after the service. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him as the other mourners filtered away. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was different from her usual carefree tone. She said she knew that Peter was Spider-Man, had known for months, had watched him struggle with the secret and had said nothing because it wasn't her place to interfere. But now Gwen was dead and Peter looked like he wanted to die too, and MJ couldn't stay silent anymore. Peter should have been shocked or angry or defensive, but he was too empty for those emotions. He just nodded, acknowledging what she'd said, and then he walked away. Because even MJ's understanding, even having someone who knew the truth, didn't change anything. Gwen was still dead. His web had still killed her, and no amount of shared knowledge could fix that. The days after the funeral blurred together into a gray fog of barely functioning. Peter stopped going to classes, stopped taking photographs, stopped returning phone calls. Aunt May worried herself sick, showing up at his apartment with food he didn't eat and concern he couldn't accept. She thought he was grieving a girlfriend's death, which was true, but she had no idea about the guilt that came with it. Had no idea that Peter blamed himself completely and absolutely for Gwen's murder. Harry Osborn was dealing with his own nightmare. His father was dead, killed by his own glider during a fight with Spider-Man. The police had investigated, found evidence of Norman's double life as the Green Goblin, discovered the lair where he'd kept his equipment. Harry's entire understanding of his father had been destroyed. The man he'd spent his life trying to please had been a supervillain, a murderer, a monster who had killed his best friend's girlfriend. But Harry's grief took a different shape than Peter's. Harry couldn't accept that his father had been evil, couldn't reconcile the man who raised him with the Green Goblin who had terrorized New York. So Harry did what people in denial often do. He rewrote the narrative, convinced himself that his father had been a good man driven to madness by Spider-Man, that the web-slinger was the real villain, the one who had destroyed the Osborn family. Harry's addiction intensified as he spiraled deeper into this delusion, and Peter watched his best friend slip away but couldn't help him. Couldn't tell Harry the truth without revealing his own identity. Spider-Man disappeared from New York streets for 3 weeks after Gwen's death. No sightings, no photographs in the Daily Bugle, no webs swinging between buildings. The criminal element of the city noticed and took advantage, and crime rates spiked. People speculated about what happened to Spider-Man. Some thought he'd been killed. Others thought he'd given up. Jonah Jameson published editorials claiming good riddance, that the menace was finally gone. But Peter hadn't quit. He just stopped being able to put on the mask. Every time he looked at his web shooters, he saw Gwen falling, saw the web catching her leg, heard the sound her neck made when it snapped. The costume sat in his closet like an accusation, and Peter couldn't touch it. Couldn't be Spider-Man because being Spider-Man had killed the person he loved most. The guilt was comprehensive and suffocating. Peter replayed the moment endlessly in his mind, analyzing every choice, every second, looking for the point where he could have done something different. Should he have caught her differently? Should he have aimed for her torso instead of her leg? Should he have jumped after her instead of using his web? Should he have moved faster, been smarter, anticipated Norman's move before it happened? The questions spiraled without answers because the truth was inescapable. His power had killed her. The thing that made him Spider-Man, the enhanced strength and speed and web-slinging ability, had been the instrument of Gwen's death. George Stacy's last words haunted him with new cruelty. Be good to her, Peter had promised. had sworn to protect Gwen, to take care of her, to honor her father's dying wish. And he'd failed in the most absolute way possible. Not only hadn't he protected her, he'd killed her himself. The weight of that failure was crushing, existential, the kind of guilt that doesn't fade with time but grows heavier the longer you carry it. Aunt May eventually got Peter to talk, not about the truth but about his feelings. She'd lost Uncle Ben, understood grief's weight, knew that sometimes the living needed permission to keep living. She told Peter that Gwen wouldn't want him to give up on life. That loss was part of being human, that everyone carried scars, that the question wasn't whether you'd be hurt but what you did after the hurt happened. She was trying to help, and Peter loved her for it, but her words couldn't reach the core of his guilt. Because Aunt May thought Gwen had died in a random act of violence. She didn't know that Peter's choices, Peter's identity, Peter's very existence as Spider-Man had painted a target on Gwen's back. The turning point came 3 weeks and 2 days after Gwen's death. Peter was in his apartment, staring at the Spider-Man costume, when he heard sirens. Multiple sirens, the kind that meant something major was happening. He turned on the news and saw footage of the Vulture attacking a commercial airliner. The villain had grabbed onto the plane during takeoff and was tearing through the fuselage, threatening everyone on board. The news anchor estimated 200 passengers, 200 people about to die because Spider-Man wasn't there to stop it. Peter watched the footage and felt nothing. Then he thought about Gwen, about how she'd believed in doing the right thing, in using your abilities to help others, in responsibility and sacrifice. She'd admired those qualities in her father, had loved them in Peter even though she never knew he was Spider-Man. And Peter realized something. Quitting didn't honor Gwen's memory. It dishonored it, because Gwen had believed that capable people had an obligation to help, and Peter was capable. His guilt didn't change that. His grief didn't erase his abilities. And 200 people were about to die while he sat in his apartment feeling sorry for himself. He put on the costume. It felt wrong, heavy in ways it never had before. But he put it on anyway, and he swung toward the airport, and he saved those people. Caught the Vulture and webbed him up and made sure the plane landed safely. The passengers cheered. The news called him a hero. Peter felt nothing except the knowledge that he'd done what needed to be done. Spider-Man returned to New York streets after that, but he was different. The quips stopped. The jokes disappeared. Peter fought crime with grim efficiency, taking down criminals without the banter that had defined his early career. He was competent and effective and utterly joyless. This was Spider-Man as obligation rather than adventure, as penance rather than heroism. Peter wasn't saving people because it made him feel good. He was saving them because not saving them meant more guilt, and he was already drowning in guilt. His relationships changed in the aftermath of Gwen's death. Mary Jane became a constant presence in his life, not as a romantic interest, but as someone who understood both sides of him. She knew about Spider-Man and she'd known Gwen, which made her the only person who could comprehend the full scope of Peter's loss. They'd sit together in silence sometimes, MJ not trying to fix anything, just being present. It was comfort of a kind, though it didn't heal anything. Harry Osborn's friendship with Peter fractured completely. Harry's delusion about his father deepened, and he began blaming Spider-Man more vocally for the Osborn family's destruction. He didn't know he was blaming Peter, but Peter heard every accusation like a knife wound. Their conversations became tense and painful, filled with subtext neither could acknowledge. Peter wanted to help Harry, wanted to pull his friend back from the edge of madness, but every interaction pushed Harry further into darkness. Aunt May never learned the truth, but she saw the change in her nephew. Saw the way he carried himself differently, heavier, older. She worried constantly, tried to set him up with girls, suggested he consider therapy or take a break from school. Peter accepted her concern with numb appreciation, but couldn't explain that therapy couldn't fix what was broken in him. That time wouldn't heal this wound because the wound was self-inflicted and deserved. The nightmare started a month after Gwen's death and never really stopped. Peter would dream of the bridge, of Gwen falling, but in the dreams he'd catch her differently. Sometimes he'd save her. Sometimes he'd fall with her. Sometimes she'd look at him and know he was Peter and forgive him. Sometimes she'd look at him and know he was Peter and hate him. He'd wake up sweating and confused, reaching for someone who wasn't there, and the mornings after those dreams were the hardest. Peter's academic performance suffered catastrophically. He'd been on track to graduate with honors, but grief destroyed his focus. He missed exams, turned in papers late or not at all, stopped participating in class discussions. Professors who'd once praised his potential now looked at him with concern and disappointment. His scholarship was threatened. His future evaporated. But Peter couldn't make himself care about grades when Gwen's death had revealed how meaningless normal life was compared to the weight of his responsibilities. The superhero community noticed the change in Spider-Man 2. The Fantastic Four's Reed Richards reached out, offered support and resources. Captain America spoke to him after a team-up, tried to share his own experiences with loss and survivor's guilt. Peter appreciated the gestures but couldn't accept the help, because his situation was different. Captain America hadn't killed the person he was trying to save. Reed Richards hadn't watched his own powers become the instrument of his loved one's death. Peter's guilt was unique and isolating, and nobody's well-meaning advice could touch it. Gradually, painfully, Peter built a new version of himself. Not better than before, not healed but functional. He learned to carry the grief the way you carry a permanent injury, adjusting his movements around it, accommodating its weight. He went back to school, forced himself through the motions of completing his degree. He took more photographs, needing the money, hating the irony that he profited from Spider-Man's activities. He kept being Spider-Man because not being Spider-Man meant more people would die, and he couldn't allow that, couldn't let Gwen's death be meaningless. The change in Peter wasn't growth or recovery. It was calcification. He became harder, colder, more isolated. The parts of him that had been warm and hopeful and capable of joy froze over, and what remained was duty and responsibility and endless, grinding determination. This version of Peter Parker could function, could go to class and fight crime and maintain relationships, but he was fundamentally altered, shaped by loss into something sharp and unforgiving. Mary Jane watched this transformation with sadness and understanding. She'd cared about Gwen too, mourned her friend's death, but she also saw what it was doing to Peter. Saw him becoming a machine that looked human but felt hollow. She tried to reach the real Peter underneath, the one who still felt things, but he'd buried that person so deep even he couldn't find it anymore. By the end of 1973, 6 months after Gwen's death, Peter had established his new normal. He was Spider-Man again, fully functional, stopping crimes and saving lives. He was a student again, barely passing but passing. He was a nephew and friend again, present if not entirely there. But he wasn't Peter Parker anymore, not really. He was someone wearing Peter Parker's face, going through Peter Parker's life, carrying Peter Parker's responsibilities. The person who had loved Gwen Stacy, who had dreamed of a future with her, who had believed he could balance 2 lives, was gone. That Peter had died on a bridge holding a dead woman and understanding the true cost of heroism. What remained was Spider-Man. Just Spider-Man. The mask that couldn't come off anymore because underneath it was only grief and guilt, and the grim determination to make sure nobody else died the way Gwen had. This was the second rise, but it wasn't a victory. It was survival. It was learning to function despite being broken. It was accepting that some losses don't heal, they just become part of who you are. And Peter Parker became a man defined by loss, shaped by tragedy, forever carrying the weight of a death he'd caused while trying to prevent it. The death of Gwen Stacy didn't stay contained to Earth 616, the primary Marvel universe. It rippled outward through comic book history, through alternate realities, through adaptations and reimaginings, becoming a foundational myth that defined not just Spider-Man but superhero storytelling itself. What happened on that bridge became a template. a warning, a prophecy that played out across dozens of universes with variations that were sometimes merciful and sometimes even more cruel. In Earth 65, the universe that would come to be known as Spider-Gwen's reality, the tragedy inverted. Here it wasn't Gwen who died but Peter. Peter Parker, bullied and isolated, had used a formula to transform himself into the lizard, and during the confrontation that followed, he died in Gwen's arms. She had been the one bitten by the radioactive spider. She had been the hero, and she had failed to save the boy she cared about. The guilt that defined Peter in the main universe defined Gwen in this one. She became Spider-Woman, later Ghost Spider, carrying the same burden of responsibility and loss that haunted her counterpart's boyfriend across dimensional barriers. Spider-Gwen's universe showed readers something crucial. The tragedy wasn't about gender or specific circumstances. It was about the fundamental tension between power and powerlessness, between wanting to save everyone and learning that some losses are inevitable. Gwen Stacy of Earth 65 fought crime while being hunted by her own father, Captain George Stacy, who didn't know his daughter was the vigilante he was trying to arrest. The same family dynamic, the same secrets, the same impossible burden, just redistributed to different characters. The multiverse proved that the story was universal. In the Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610, Gwen Stacy's fate took an even darker turn. She didn't die from a fall. She became Carnage. The symbiote that in the main universe had bonded with serial killer Cletus Cassidy instead bonded with Gwen, transforming her into a monster. Peter had to fight the woman he loved, while she was wearing an alien creature that amplified aggression and bloodlust. She died as Carnage, killed during a confrontation that left Peter traumatized in entirely new ways. Here the tragedy wasn't that Peter's powers killed her. It was that he had to kill her himself, or allow her to kill innocence. Either way, he lost her. The clone saga of the 1990s showed how deeply Gwen's death had wounded Peter by revealing what happened in the immediate aftermath. Miles Warren, a professor at Empire State University who had taught both Peter and Gwen, had been obsessed with her. Obsessed in the clinical, disturbing sense. He'd been in love with his student, had watched her from afar, had collected samples of her DNA for genetic research. When Gwen died, Warren's sanity broke completely. He transformed himself into the Jackal and cloned her, creating multiple Gwen Stacy copies using the same technology he'd used to clone Peter. The clones were torture for Peter in ways Norman Osborn couldn't have imagined. Each one had Gwen's face, Gwen's voice, Gwen's memories up to a certain point. They believed they were the real Gwen Stacy. Some were heroic, trying to make sense of their existence. Others were villainous, twisted by the knowledge that they were copies. Peter had to confront them, fight them, watch them die again and again. Each clone's death reopened the wound, made him relive that night on the bridge, forced him to process his grief in new and horrible ways. One clone, who took the name Abigail Mercury, survived the clone saga and tried to build her own life. She had all of Gwen's memories and intelligence but knew she wasn't the original, wasn't the woman Peter had loved. She became a hero in her own right, using Gwen's scientific knowledge and her own unique perspective as someone who remembered dying but hadn't actually experienced it. Her existence was a philosophical nightmare, a walking reminder that the original Gwen was gone and could never be replaced no matter how perfect the copy. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy made an interesting choice by giving Gwen's role and fate to Mary Jane Watson instead, while introducing Gwen only briefly in the third film. This version showed how adaptable the archetype was. MJ was kidnapped by villains multiple times, placed in danger specifically to hurt Spider-Man, nearly died on several occasions. The threat of losing her drove Peter's choices throughout the trilogy. Whether it was the Green Goblin holding her over a bridge or Dr. Octopus threatening to drown her or Venom and Sandman using her as bait, MJ lived in the shadow of the Gwen Stacy death even though she was a different character. The Amazing Spider-Man film starring Andrew Garfield gave audiences the most direct adaptation of Gwen's story. Emma Stone played her with intelligence and agency, making Gwen an active participant in her own story rather than just a victim waiting to happen. Her death in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 recreated the bridge scene with devastating accuracy. Peter tried to save her. His web caught her. She fell anyway. The moment her head hit the ground, audiences heard the same sickening crack that comic readers had imagined in 1973. Andrew Garfield's performance after her death, the raw grief and guilt and horror, captured everything Peter Parker felt in the original story. What made the film version particularly cruel was that Gwen died at the clock tower, not a bridge. Time itself became the weapon. As she fell, the camera showed the clock's gears and mechanisms, all the precise machinery that measured seconds. It suggested that timing was everything, that if Peter had moved a fraction of a second faster or slower, if the circumstances had been infinitesimally different, he might have saved her. But he didn't. Time ran out. The clock kept ticking, and Gwen Stacy died while time continued forward without her. The film's ending showed Peter months later, still broken, visiting Gwen's grave and listening to her high school graduation speech. She talked about how life hits you with unexpected challenges, how you can't plan for tragedy, how the only choice is to keep going despite the pain. Her words became prophecy and eulogy simultaneously. Peter took her advice and became Spider-Man again, but the film made clear he was doing it without joy, purely from obligation. The final swing through New York felt melancholy rather than triumphant, a broken man forcing himself to be a hero because the alternative was unthinkable. The Spider-Verse animated films took a different approach by making Gwen Stacy herself the hero rather than the victim. Spider-Gwen became a central character, her loss of Peter Parker driving her just as the loss of Gwen drove Peter in other universes. The films explored how trauma bonds people, how shared loss creates understanding between variants who might otherwise have nothing in common. Miles Morales lost his uncle. Peter B. Parker lost Gwen. Spider-Gwen lost Peter. Each carried their grief differently, but recognized it in others. Into the Spider-Verse introduced the concept of canon events, moments that had to happen for a Spider-Person to become who they needed to be. The death of a police captain close to Spider-Man was described as a canon event, something that occurred in most timelines. George Stacy's death, Uncle Ben's death, Captain Stacy dying in Spider-Gwen's universe. The multiverse itself seemed structured around loss, around the idea that becoming Spider-Man required sacrifice and grief. It suggested that Gwen's death wasn't random but inevitable, baked into the universe's structure. Across the Spider-Verse expanded on this concept, showing hundreds of Spider-People who had each lost someone crucial. The film asked profound questions about fate and free will. If these deaths were canon events, predetermined by the multiverse's structure, did that absolve Peter of responsibility for Gwen's death? Or did it make it worse, suggesting that loving her had been doomed from the start, that their relationship was always building toward tragedy? The film didn't offer easy answers, instead suggesting that the pain was the point, that loss shaped heroes into who they needed to become. Video games explored Gwen's legacy differently. In Marvel's Spider-Man for PlayStation 4, she never appeared but her absence was felt. Peter's relationship with Mary Jane was complicated by his past, by losses he carried but didn't discuss. The game suggested that this version of Peter had lost someone before, that his hesitance to commit to MJ came from understanding how dangerous it was to love someone while being Spider-Man. Though Gwen wasn't named, her shadow was present in every moment Peter pulled away from happiness because he was afraid of what it would cost. The cultural impact of Gwen Stacy's death extended beyond Spider-Man. She became the template for fridging, the term comic fans use when female characters are killed to motivate male heroes. The criticism is valid even as it misses nuance. Gwen's death was revolutionary because it proved superhero comics could have permanent consequences, could hurt readers, could change characters forever. But it also established a problematic pattern where women's primary narrative function was dying to give heroes angst and motivation. Later writers tried to reclaim Gwen's agency by emphasizing her intelligence and capability before her death. She wasn't just Peter's girlfriend. She was a brilliant scientist in her own right, someone who made discoveries and had ambitions beyond her relationship. Her death was tragic not just because Peter lost her, but because the world lost everything she might have contributed. All the research she might have done, all the lives she might have saved with her scientific work, all the ways she might have changed the world. That was the real loss, the life unlived rather than just the relationship ended. The Gwen Stacy template influenced decades of storytelling: Superman's death and return, the murder of Jason Todd, the second Robin, the death of Captain America, the destruction of Asgard. Comic books learned from Gwen that death could be meaningful, that loss could permanently alter characters, that readers would accept and even appreciate stories that hurt them if the pain felt earned. Every major character death in superhero comics since 1973 owes something to the night Gwen Stacy died. But the influence wasn't purely about death. It was about responsibility and consequences. Gwen's death taught comic writers that actions matter, that heroes can fail, that power doesn't guarantee happy endings. It matured the medium. Before Gwen, superhero comics were primarily power fantasies for children. After Gwen, they became capable of tragedy, of examining moral complexity, of asking hard questions about what heroism costs and whether that cost is worth paying. In the main continuity, Earth 616, Gwen Stacy remains dead. Despite all the resurrections and retcons that happen regularly in comics, despite characters dying and returning with predictable frequency, Gwen stays gone. Her death is sacred in a way few comic deaths are. Bringing her back permanently would undermine everything her loss meant to Peter, would cheapen the sacrifice and grief that defined him for 50 years. So she stays dead, appearing in flashbacks and dreams and what-if scenarios but never truly returning. Her legacy lives on in every Spider-Person who understands that with great power comes not just great responsibility but great loss. In every hero who learns that you can't save everyone. In every relationship that ends in tragedy because the villain found the hero's weak point. In every moment a superhero hesitates to get close to someone because they know love creates vulnerability. Gwen Stacy, brilliant and kind and doomed, became the ghost that haunts not just Peter Parker but the entire superhero genre. Her death was the moment comics grew up and learned that some things, once broken, can never be fixed. In the main Marvel universe, Earth 616, Gwen Stacy has now been dead for over 50 years of publication history. Half a century of comics have been written, thousands of stories told, entire generations of readers introduced to Spider-Man, and through all of it, Gwen has remained deceased. Her permanence in death has become almost as important as the death itself. In an industry where resurrection is common, where characters die and return with predictable regularity, Gwen staying dead means something. She appears in flashbacks with notable frequency. Writers return to her again and again, showing moments from her relationship with Peter that readers never saw the first time. These scenes serve multiple purposes. They deepen the tragedy by showing how genuine their love was. They give Peter moments of happiness that make his current loneliness more painful by contrast. They remind readers what was lost, not just a character but a future, a path Peter's life could have taken if things had gone differently. Recent comics have explored Peter's continuing grief in sophisticated ways. In the Nick Spencer run on Amazing Spider-Man, Peter had dreams about Gwen where she was alive and they were married. The dreams felt so real that waking from them was traumatic, forcing Peter to relive her loss each time. These weren't just nostalgia or sentiment. They were examinations of how grief never fully resolves, how it changes shape over time but never truly leaves. The Kindred storyline, which ran from 2018 to 2021, brought Gwen's memory back in horrifying ways. The villain Kindred was eventually revealed to be connected to Harry Osborn and the sins of Norman Osborn, creating a direct link back to the original tragedy. The story suggested that Gwen's death had consequences that echoed forward through decades, that the original sin of the Green Goblin killing her had poisoned Peter's life in ways that were still revealing themselves 50 years later. Spider-Gwen, or Ghost Spider as she's now known, has become a major character in her own right. She exists in Earth 65 but frequently crosses over to Earth 616, where she interacts with Peter Parker. Their relationship is complicated and strange. He sees her and is reminded of the woman he lost. She sees him and is reminded of the boy she failed to save. They're bonded by parallel traumas, understanding each other in ways nobody else can, but their friendship is built on the foundation of their respective failures. Ghost Spider's solo series has explored her life independent of Peter Parker's tragedy. She's a hero who exists beyond being a gender-swapped Spider-Man, with her own rogues gallery, her own supporting cast, her own narrative identity. She plays in a band called the Mary Janes, fights crime in her own universe, navigates relationships with friends who know her identity. The character has successfully escaped being defined solely by her connection to Peter, which is itself a kind of redemption. The Gwen Stacy who died never got to become her own person independent of her boyfriend. Spider-Gwen does. The current Spider-Man comics show Peter in a relationship with Mary Jane, though it's complicated and frequently on-again, off-again, depending on which writer is handling the book. MJ knows his identity, understands the risks, chooses to be with him anyway. But the ghost of Gwen is always present in their relationship. Peter's fear of losing MJ the way he lost Gwen creates distance and problems. His guilt about moving on, about finding happiness with someone else when Gwen is dead, surfaces in moments of stress. The relationship works when it works because MJ is patient and understanding and willing to accept that Peter carries scars that will never fully heal. Fan theories about Gwen Stacy tend to focus on three main areas. First, whether she'll ever be resurrected permanently. Second, whether there are untold secrets about her death. And third, what role she'll play in future multiversal stories. The resurrection theory has the most evidence behind it. In comic books, death is rarely permanent. Characters die and return constantly, often through convoluted explanations involving clones or time travel or magical resurrections or retcons that claim they never really died. Jean Grey has died and returned multiple times. Captain America died and came back. Even Uncle Ben was briefly resurrected in a clone body. Given this pattern, many fans believe it's only a matter of time before some writer brings Gwen back. The evidence for this theory includes the Clone Saga, which showed that Gwen's DNA exists and has been used to create clones before. It includes the multiverse, which provides infinite versions of Gwen who could potentially cross over permanently. It includes the precedent of other characters returning from similarly definitive deaths. And it includes the commercial reality that Gwen Stacy is a popular character whose return would generate significant media attention and sales. But the evidence against resurrection is stronger. Gwen's death is foundational to Spider-Man's character. It's the moment that defined him, that showed him the cost of being a hero, that gave him the grief and guilt that makes him who he is. Bringing her back would undermine 50 years of character development. It would cheapen the sacrifice and make her death retroactively meaningless. Marvel editorial has suggested multiple times that Gwen will remain dead because her death is too important to undo. The second major theory suggests there are secrets about Gwen's death that haven't been revealed. Some fans believe she was already dying before Norman threw her off the bridge, that he'd poisoned her, or that she had a medical condition. Others suggest she might have been pregnant, which would add another layer of tragedy to Peter's loss. Still, others theorize that Norman had additional motivations beyond simple revenge, perhaps related to genetic research or Oscorp's experiments. The most controversial theory in this category relates to the Sins Past storyline from 2004. This story revealed that Gwen had allegedly had an affair with Norman Osborn before her death and given birth to twins who aged rapidly due to the goblin formula in their blood. The storyline was almost universally hated by fans and was later retconned to suggest the children were experiments rather than biological offspring. But some fans still believe there are unexplored elements of Gwen's life before her death, secrets she kept from Peter that might explain aspects of her relationship with the Osborn family. The problem with these theories is that they risk diminishing Gwen's character. She was defined by her intelligence, her kindness, her genuine love for Peter. Adding secret affairs or hidden pregnancies or mysterious illnesses doesn't enhance her tragedy. It just makes it tawdry, turns a story about loss and responsibility into a soap opera. Most fans recognize this, which is why these theories remain marginal rather than widely accepted. The third major theory focuses on Gwen's role in future multiversal stories. The Spider-Verse concept has shown that infinite versions of Spider characters exist across infinite realities. We've seen dozens of Spider-People, from Spider-Ham to Spider-Man Noir to Penny Parker. The multiverse is vast enough to contain any variation imaginable. Some fans theorize that future stories will introduce new versions of Gwen Stacy from realities we haven't seen yet. This theory has already proven partially correct. Beyond Spider-Gwen, we've seen Gwenpool, a character from a universe where Gwen Stacy gains reality-warping powers and knowledge of comic book conventions. We've seen Captain America Gwen, a version where she received the super soldier serum. We've seen Spider-Gwen variations with different costumes and power sets. The multiverse concept allows writers to explore what-if scenarios with Gwen endlessly without bringing back the Earth 616 version. The upcoming Spider-Man films will likely continue exploring multiversal concepts, and Spider-Gwen will almost certainly play a role. The character has become popular enough to potentially carry her own film franchise. There's commercial incentive to keep producing Gwen Stacy content, but that content will likely focus on alternate universe versions rather than resurrecting the original. Looking forward, several possibilities exist for how Gwen's legacy might continue. Marvel could produce more stories about her life before her death, filling in gaps in her history with Peter. They could expand Spider-Gwen's role in the main universe, making her a permanent member of Earth 616's hero community. They could introduce new multiversal variants with fresh takes on the character, or they could leave her largely as she is, a presence felt through absence, the ghost that haunts Peter Parker and reminds readers of what heroism costs. The most likely future is a combination of these approaches. Spider-Gwen will continue having adventures in her own universe while occasionally crossing over. The original Gwen will appear in flashbacks and dream sequences and time travel stories. New variants might be introduced when writers have genuinely new ideas about what to do with the character. But Earth 616 Gwen will remain dead because her death is too important to undo. What Gwen Stacy has left to resolve isn't about her returning or revealing secrets or playing a larger role in the narrative. It's about Peter finally, fully processing her loss. 50 years later, he's still carrying that grief, still questioning whether he could have saved her, still wondering if being Spider-Man is worth the cost. Future stories will likely explore his continuing journey toward something like acceptance, understanding that Gwen's death wasn't his fault even though his web killed her, recognizing that she would want him to be happy rather than spending his life in penance. The question isn't whether Gwen will return. It's whether Peter can let her go, not forget her or stop loving her or pretend she didn't matter, but accept that she's gone, that he can't change what happened, that his responsibility is to the living rather than the dead. That's the story still being told. That's the arc still unfolding across decades of comics. That's what Gwen Stacy's legacy is really about. Not her death, but what Peter does with the life he has left after losing her. There's a panel from Amazing Spider-Man issue 122, the issue immediately after Gwen's death, that captures everything about what her loss means. Peter is sitting alone in his apartment, still in costume but with his mask off, head in his hands. The caption reads, "In the end, there is only Peter Parker, the boy, and the crushing weight of what he has done. Not what was done to him, not what the Green Goblin did, what he has done." That distinction, that acceptance of responsibility even for a tragedy he didn't intend, defines not just Peter Parker but the entire philosophy of Spider-Man. Gwen Stacy represents something fundamental about the human condition that transcends superhero stories. She represents the fragility of happiness, the way the things we love most can be taken from us in an instant, without warning, without fairness, without any regard for how much we need them. Every person alive has lost something or someone they couldn't afford to lose. Every person has experienced the moment when they realize that wanting something desperately doesn't mean they get to keep it. Gwen's death is that universal experience distilled into its purest, most painful form. What makes her story resonate across generations isn't just the tragedy itself, but what it reveals about love and responsibility. Peter Parker loved Gwen Stacy completely. He wanted to marry her, build a life with her, give her everything she deserved. But he also loved being Spider-Man, loved the feeling of helping people, couldn't abandon his responsibility to the city even when that responsibility threatened his personal happiness. He tried to have both. He tried to believe that with enough strength and speed and determination, he could protect the people he loved while also protecting strangers. And he learned, in the cruelest possible way, that sometimes those two imperatives are incompatible. The deeper message isn't that heroes should avoid relationships or that loving someone is a weakness. It's that vulnerability is the price of connection. When you love someone, you give them the power to destroy you. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but simply by being mortal, by being capable of being hurt or lost or taken away. Peter gave Gwen that power when he fell in love with her. And Norman Osborn recognized it and exploited it, using Peter's love as a weapon against him. But here's the part that makes Gwen's story more than just a cautionary tale. Peter didn't stop loving after losing her, didn't close himself off completely or decide that isolation was safer than connection. He was damaged, certainly. He carried the guilt and grief for the rest of his life. He was more careful, more protective, more aware of how dangerous it was to love someone while being Spider-Man. But he still loved. He built a relationship with Mary Jane. He formed friendships with other heroes. He remained connected to Aunt May. He chose to stay human even after learning how much being human could hurt. That's the real heroism. Not the web-slinging or the villain fighting or the city saving. The heroism is continuing to care about people, even after caring about someone got them killed. The heroism is accepting that responsibility means bearing unbearable weight and carrying it anyway. The heroism is understanding that power doesn't prevent tragedy. It just gives you more ways to blame yourself when tragedy happens, and choosing to keep using that power anyway. Gwen Stacy's story asks a question that every hero, fictional or real, must eventually confront. Is it worth it? Is being Spider-Man worth losing the woman you love? Is saving strangers worth the guilt of failing to save someone who trusted you? Is responsibility worth the sacrifice it demands? Peter's answer, demonstrated through 50 years of continuing to be Spider-Man despite his grief, is yes. Not because the math works out, not because saving thousands justifies losing one, but because the alternative is worse. The alternative is letting Gwen's death be meaningless, letting his guilt paralyze him, abandoning the responsibility that gave his life purpose in the first place. Why audiences connect with this story so deeply comes down to recognition. We recognize Peter's guilt, because we've all felt responsible for things beyond our control. We recognize his grief because we've all lost people we weren't ready to lose. We recognize his struggle to keep going because we've all had moments when continuing felt impossible but stopping felt worse. Gwen's death isn't just a plot point in a superhero story. It's a mirror reflecting our own experiences with loss and responsibility, and the terrible burden of caring about things we can't protect. The physics of her death adds another layer of meaning. The fact that Peter's web killed her, that his attempt to save her was what caused her death, represents every time we've tried to help and made things worse. Every time good intentions led to bad outcomes. Every time our strength wasn't enough or was too much or was applied at the wrong moment in the wrong way. The universe doesn't care about intentions. It cares about results. And the result was that Gwen Stacy died because Peter Parker tried to save her. But there's something else in that moment worth examining. Peter tried. He saw Gwen falling and he didn't freeze, didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the odds or consider the risks. He just acted, using everything he had to save her. The fact that it didn't work, that his best effort was insufficient, doesn't change the fundamental heroism of the attempt. Sometimes we fail despite doing everything right. Sometimes the universe is cruel and random and unfair. And the question becomes whether we keep trying after learning that trying doesn't guarantee success. Gwen would have wanted Peter to keep trying. That's important. She believed in responsibility and service, and using your abilities to help others. Those were values she got from her father, values she admired in Peter even though she didn't know the full extent of how he lived them. If she could have chosen her legacy, it wouldn't have been making Peter quit. It would have been inspiring him to continue, to honor her memory by being the hero she believed he could be.